But what I'm already hearing is, going back to the start, an openness anyway to multiple ways of looking at a complex social phenomenon. What I heard you just say is that a kind of quantitative counting, whether it's public opinion research or other kinds of quantitative approach, that's not adequate, but I also heard you say it's a part of the story. Mm-hmm. And so already in this early part of your own kind of sociological, governmental, political imagination, there's a sense of multiple approaches to a complicated problem.
There is, and unfortunately it came to me a little bit late. I was of the generation of Berkeley graduate students for whom numbers were inherently suspect and for whom quantitative methods were inherently bourgeois. Remember, no reason you should know this, I was a graduate student at Berkeley in the 60s, and I spent as much time on the streets and in the plaza as I did in the library annex where I had a tiny office. And so I never learned the methods of quantitative social science, and I've paid for that ever since because I've been self-taught. It was only when I got to Italy and began to do the research that I realized that the most interesting way of comparing the party in these two regions would be to take samples of its own cadres in North and South and ask them a series of questions about the way they worked, about the problems they encountered, about their own backgrounds, about their political perspectives. And in order to do that, I needed to put together a questionnaire, and that questionnaire would eventually need to be coded quantitatively. And there I was, ill-equipped to carry this kind of work out. So I'm a self-taught methodologist, and I'm firmly of the belief that the method should be suited to the problem, rather than the problem being determined by your particular repertoire of methodological tools. That was a method that I used in Italy in studying the Communist Party, but I used it alongside other methods as well. For example, you may be interested to know that I started my interviews in Italy knowing nothing about Antonio Gramsci, who was the theoretical founder of the Italian Communist Party, and was informed from my first interview on that I would be able to understand nothing about either communism or southern Italy until I'd read Gramsci. And so I sat down for 3 weeks and did nothing but read the prison notebooks and notes on Machiavelli, so that the next time I came into an interview with a communist intellectual, I wouldn't be as ignorant as I had been at first. That formed a particular part of peasant communism in southern Italy, which was the book that came out of my dissertation. And interestingly enough, that was the part of the book that was most controversial to my Italian communist friends. When they read my book, I had expected that they would find the quantitative analysis most other, most foreign. In fact, they were fascinated by it and found that it resonated with their own anecdotal experiences. It was when they read the part about Gramsci, which I had literally taken from my respondents, that there was the most controversy and the most febrile criticism of the book. But you touch on a point that I think is close to my heart, and that is that the method should suit the problem rather than the problem suiting the method. And when I went on to do my second major study, which was a comparison of rural and small town mayors in in Italy in general and in France, I followed up on the quantitative side of the research, but it grew out of an experience living in a village in southern France. My friend Roger Masters, who was a Rousseau scholar at the time, had spent a year in a village in the south of France called Mossan-les-Alpes, living in a house that was built in the same year that Rousseau's social contract was built. This was very symbolic for both Roger and myself. And as a way of familiarizing myself with the life of the village, I made an appointment to see the mayor of the village. This was a mayor of a village of some 2,000 souls who had, as I understood it, been the mayor during the Vichy years, and therefore was, I imagined, a man of the right. He greeted me with some formality, but in a very friendly way. We sat down and began to talk, and I said to the mayor, thinking I knew what the answer would be, "How long have you been in politics, Monsieur le Maire?" And the mayor said, "Oh, I'm not in politics." Now, the idea that a mayor could not be in politics was absurd to me, both from my American experience and from my Italian experience. So I followed this up with a few other questions, and the mayor consistently and determinedly said, no, what I do is administration. It's not politics. And I left, and I thought, well, this may be an overreaction of a man who was burned during the Vichy years because he got engaged in politics, and so he may be insisting too much that he's not in politics, and probably the mayor in the next village, who, as I knew, was a communist, would give me a very different answer. And so out of curiosity, without intending to make a research project out of this, I made an appointment to see the mayor in the next village, which was a tiny, even tinier place. He was an older peasant. He was, as I found out, a communist. And I sat down in his office, and he too greeted me very warmly, asked what I would like to know, and my first question was, "How long, Monsieur le Maire, have you been in politics?" And his answer was, "Oh, I'm not in politics. I'm an administrator." Well, this began to raise my curiosity, and it raised my curiosity because I thought I knew that these guys were in politics, but also because I had had experience in Italy with mayors in small towns who I'd interviewed in the connection with my first study, and I thought I would never, ever find a mayor in a small town in Italy who would claim absurdly not to be in politics. Well, I did a few more interviews, all in the same small region of southern France, and found significant commonality in the responses. And that led me to my second project, which was a paired comparison of small town and rural mayors in Italy and France. A book called Between Center and Periphery resulted from this, and it was based on some 250 interviews, carefully matched in 4 different regions of the 2 countries, with an identical interview schedule, and the collaboration of a number of young people who worked with me carrying out the interviews in Italy and in France, and then helping me to analyze the data when I got back to America. And as I had predicted, the differences were dramatic. There was virtually no Italian mayor who made the claim of not being in politics. And there were relatively few, there were some, but there were relatively few French mayors who admitted to being militants or activists in a political party. The rest of the book was engaged in an attempt to explain these outcomes. And I explained it in historical and institutional terms. I explained it in terms of the way the pattern of centralization had grown up in France compared to the more diffuse history of centralization in Italy, and I explained it in terms of the relatively weaker articulation of the party system in the French periphery compared to a much greater rooting of the party system in Italy. And out of these reflections and these 2 sources of data, I came up with a theory that these 2 countries exhibited 2 different modes of policy entrepreneurship, 2 different modes of brokerage between center and periphery. And that, in turn, was the start of my interest in one of the major mechanisms that turns up in my later work, and particularly in my collaborative work with Chuck Tilley, and that is the importance of brokerage.